is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen. Our top stories: civilians continue to flee Kherson as Russia intensifies its attacks, while France's defence minister arrives in Kyiv amid criticism over his country's support. Our other headlines: Moscow rejects a plan to end this conflict put forward by Ukraine. It included the full withdrawal of Russian troops and recognition of Ukraine's territorial integrity. It's takeoff for international flights in and out of China following the lifting of coronavirus restrictions. And the death toll reaches 60 as the United States counts the cost of a once-in-a-generation storm. France's defence minister has just arrived in Kyiv in the first visit by a top French diplomat since Russia launched its invasion in February. Sébastien Lecornu's arrival follows a trip to Poland and coincides with another wave of rocket attacks by Russia, concentrated on the city of Kherson, where thousands of people are fleeing their homes. Well, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and BlackRock CEO Larry Fink have agreed to coordinate investment in rebuilding Ukraine. Kyiv announced that the two had agreed to a joint effort in directing potential investment into the reconstruction of the country. BlackRock Financial Markets Advisory and the Ukrainian Ministry of Economy signed the Memorandum of Understanding in November. Members of the BlackRock team will now travel to Ukraine in the new year. Well, Moscow has rejected a 10-point plan to end this conflict put forward by the Ukrainian president. The proposals by President Zelensky were first outlined at the G20 summit last month, and they include the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and recognition of its territorial integrity. Let's talk to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, what has the Kremlin said about these proposals?
Well, the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, the Russian president's spokesperson, focused on one of those points, which was the call to go back to how Ukraine used to be in terms of territorial integrity. So pre-Crimea in 2014, with the DNR, LNR back as part of Ukraine and the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, as before February, all part of Ukrainian territory. Now, he said that such an agreement would not result in peace, that this was something completely untenable to Moscow, as he has said before, in terms of returning territory once considered Ukrainian even by Russia, but now firmly constitutionally bound to Russia. Another reaction to the other points came from the foreign minister here in Russia, who focused on the suggestion that Russian troops would need to completely leave Ukraine. He said that that was simply untenable. He said that the aims of the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine can only be achieved with the Russian armed forces unless the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agrees to negotiate with Russia on joint security guarantees. That would mean that Russia feels comfortable. Those likely to be seen as huge concessions by Ukraine, and so no politicians here really taking this particular plan particularly seriously.
Stuart, any more reaction to President Putin's proposed ban on Russian oil exports to countries that agreed to the price cap?
Yeah, it's due to come into effect in February next year, and that gives time for the government, as it's been asked to, as part of this decree, to come up with the specifics, the detail about how it would be enforced. And that's one of the main factors that analysts here and abroad have been focusing on upon concluding that this is something that is quite vague at the moment. Although it says basically that Russia will not export oil to nations that are engaged in a price cap. There's little more than that, and so it's being seen as a wait-and-see response. It's also being interpreted by some as a weak response, because what Russia could have done here is said that in response to the West price maximum price, Russia could impose a minimum price for its oil, which would have affected the oil markets as the original European Union and American price cap did, and that option was not chosen. So for now, it's still more of wait and see. Some analysts saying we'll even have to wait 6 months before knowing whether the Western price cap is effective at all. Now, there are some signs it is. In December, the first week of December, Russian oil exports fell by half, and the finance minister admitted it's going to be more expensive for Russia to export its oil because new buyers do not have the infrastructure set up like China and India, and also it is going to be more difficult, but intends to do so. In the meantime, though, economists say Russia will lose about 5% of its oil production. It will have to cut that, and it's likely to lose a quarter of its oil and gas revenue while it tries to find those new markets. A hit for sure, but not one anyone here is expecting will completely stop Russia's action in Ukraine. It's confident still it has the reserve funds to make it through.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Now, the rest of the day's news, and China is open for business to international flights following the lifting of coronavirus restrictions from the 8th of January. Certain flights will no longer be branded as high risk, and planes will be able to fly at full capacity rather than a 75% passenger limit. Immigration procedures will also be simplified, but the wearing of masks will still be enforced. This all comes after the country announced an end to mandatory quarantine for inbound travellers. Well, the huge shift in China's COVID border policy is sparking something of a travel and tourism rush, not least in Hong Kong. Officials there have followed Beijing's example by scrapping nearly all COVID restrictions, including the need for testing on arrival. Our correspondent Richard Kimber reports.
Hong Kong's Chief Executive John Lee says that the COVID-19 situation in the territory is now controllable, with a vaccination rate of around 94% and health authorities estimating that with some 2.5 million people in Hong Kong having already contracted COVID-19 over the past 3 years, that there is enough herd immunity in the city that there should not be a need for major concern over potential future large-scale outbreaks, and therefore no need for a return to some of the city's strictest COVID-19 rules. The government and the health authorities in Hong Kong say they are committed to trying to allow the economy to open up and to allow society to return to a pre-pandemic normal.
It is to cancel all mandatory PCR tests for entering Hong Kong. Arrival from overseas, the Chinese mainland, Macau and Taiwan no longer need to undergo mandatory PCR tests after arriving in Hong Kong or on the day of arrival.
There is a sense of optimism among the business community about 2023 as a result of these relaxations, particularly knowing that there is an intent to reopen the border between Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland in the coming weeks without the need for quarantine, allowing not just family and friends to reunite, some of which will be doing so for the first time in 3 years, particularly ahead of the significant Lunar New Year holidays coming at the end of January, but also for cross-border business operations to be able to start to realise their potential again, and for many travel and tour companies that deal typically in those cross-border operations to get back on their feet after many in Hong Kong having to rely on government subsidies to survive the last 3 years. Airlines such as Cathay Pacific, Hong Kong's flagship airline, and Greater Bay Airlines say they're committed to trying to put on as many flights as possible as they see the travel demand surging. There have been reports from Chinese travel websites of a 500% surge in interest from Hong Kong residents looking to fly to the Chinese mainland, knowing that the rules there are being relaxed as well. So a sense of optimism at the end of 2022 about how the start of 2023 can process as these rules continue to be relaxed and society looks forward to returning, as I say, to some sense of pre-pandemic normalcy at the start of 2023. Richard Kimber for CGTN in Hong Kong.
Well, opening up means China is battling coronavirus cases as the country eases its lockdown. Hospitals are trying to increase intensive care facilities and make staffing more efficient. The head of intensive care at one of Beijing's biggest hospitals has been telling CGTN about the challenges.
Our priority remains treatment for respiratory failure and multiple organ failure caused by COVID-19 infections. which requires the hospital to gain both hardware and software for a timely treatment. Hardware covers a complete series of medical equipment, such as high-flow oxygen equipment and monitoring devices to support patients' respiratory systems, while software refers to doctors and nurses who are qualified to treat patients in critical conditions. This is far more important, but we still have a shortage. So how to build a professional team to treat patients with critical illness is our direction and next step.
How do you evaluate that Beijing will see its severe cases peak in the near future?
I'm aware of this view from big data and other experts, and even know that the city will face another peak after the Spring Festival. I agree, because most of the people who are among the earliest to get infected are younger generations, or those who got multiple contacts with the outside. But the infections for the elderly at home will be delayed for a while. As the virus is fast spreading, it's hard for them to protect themselves and they'll be infected last. Age 75 or above will easily turn to patients in critical conditions when infected, as many of them have underlying diseases. So it's important for the elderly group to take preventive measures and prepare some commonly used drugs at home.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, reasons to be cheerful. US market optimism over China's big reset on international travel. We're live on Wall Street next.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. China's reopening policies are injecting some confidence into the markets. US stock indices opened higher on Wednesday. Our correspondent John Terrett is watching events for us in New York. John, how much anticipation is there for what is essentially pretty much a full reopening of China's international borders?
Yeah, I know, and I think Wall Street's pretty excited about that because Wall Street was very concerned about a number of things, primarily that supply chain issues would be affected around the globe if this didn't happen. And I know that there are lots of business executives who have business in China and they want to get there to see people face-to-face, because business is best done face-to-face, as you know, and they haven't been able to for the last 2 years, and that has now all changed. So I know that Wall Street is watching this very closely and is pleased with what it sees. Now, we are expecting a surge in travel, okay, but don't get too excited, not yet. Okay, it's going to take a while, and here's the story. I mean, basically, as you've been reporting, the Chinese have abandoned the need for quarantine for people coming into China from overseas. They've downgraded the seriousness of the illness from an A to a B, and a couple of weeks ago, they reduced the quarantine time for people that do need it from 7 to 5 days. So all of that is very good. So it's a two-way benefit for US travelers and US airlines and Chinese travelers and Chinese airlines. And I think it's particularly good for Chinese people because they've never not been able to leave their country, but they have always faced difficulty getting back in, and that's now been removed. Now, China was the largest outbound destination in the world, Chinese people spending $127.5 billion prior to COVID. We think that most of them, though, are going to say, well, we'll just wait and see what happens with this. We'll just give it a bit of time. So I'm not expecting a surge when it comes to Chinese New Year in a couple of weeks' time, but most people seem to think that the surge will begin around about May Day, so in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere. United Airlines here are evaluating the situation. They've got 4 flights a week at the moment from San Fran to Shanghai. Lufthansa are saying the same. And to back up what our reporter in Hong Kong was saying just now, the website Ctrip says it saw a 10-fold increase in Chinese people Googling foreign destinations within minutes of the announcement coming out on Monday. Kunar says the same, a 7-fold increase with Japan, Thailand and the ROK, that's the Republic of Korea, South Korea to you and me, being the main destinations. And can I just quickly, sticking with airlines, very quickly, I must tell you, we have a major airline story here. Southwest Airlines, which EasyJet and Ryanair are based upon, cancelled 70% of their flights because of the storm over Christmas. 70% is an awful lot. The CEO had to apologize in video online. Basically, they took millions of dollars in COVID money from the government to keep going. And the issue is that they don't have a hub and spoke system. Most of the airlines are based all around the country, Chicago, Newark, New Jersey, or Atlanta, and they operate from there. Southwest is a nationwide airline, and they have an integrated computer system, which is why they had to cancel 70% of their flights. Now, they have very loyal customers at Southwest, it has to be said, but they're very angry right now because they couldn't get home from their Christmas holidays.
Well, we've got much more on that story later in the show. You're like an expensive warm-up man. It's an extraordinary teaser for what's coming up later. But while you're there, let me ask you about the markets today, because it's looking a bit mixed.
Yes, and it is now, funny enough, because I know you introduced me just there by saying the markets were up. Well, guess what? They ain't anymore. They're down. It's one of those days. Southwest is a big drag on the S&P 500. It's down 2.3% at the moment, $33. And I know you probably haven't heard of this company, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Generac is a big support for the S&P 500 today. Generac makes, I suppose you call them generators, really, some big, some small. And, you know, when the power goes out, which it does all the time in America, especially in storms like the one we've just had, people have these either little generators or they have big ones attached to their homes so they can at least keep the fridge going or the sump pump going or whatever it is. They don't, you know, end up in trouble. They get some lights on. Maybe they can even have a TV. Anyway, Generac has been upgraded today, so the shares are up 3%, so that's very good. Generally speaking, though, the stocks, of course, at the moment are up and down as we approach the end of the year. They're going to be deeply down for the whole of 2022, although the second half of 2023 right now is looking fairly optimistic. Right now, the Dow is down 137, but don't worry, it'll be in the green soon because it was up by the same amount a few minutes ago. And the 10-year interest rate's at 3.87%, up a little bit at the moment. And overall, by the way, I should just say the Dow is down 9% for the year, the Nasdaq 34%, and the S&P 500 flirting with bear territory at 20%. So 2022 has not been the best year for stocks, but as I said to Juliet on this program yesterday, if you stretch out the Dow Jones across all its lifetime, it's never gone down, ever. It's always up.
On that cheerful note, John Terrace, good to see you. Thank you very much for that. Our correspondent, John Terrace, in New York. Well, talking of Juliet Mann, prices of commodities and goods are beginning to come down, but there's a long way to go. That's why the Bank of England hiked UK interest rates again in December. The governor, Andrew Bailey, said there are glimmers that inflation is easing, but cost pressures remain throughout global markets. So our correspondent, Juliet Mann, looks now at the inflation picture in 2022 and what might be in store for the year ahead.
I bet you've noticed the cost of your weekly shop going up. Meat, eggs, milk, even higher production costs for coffee have filtered through to price tags. Food inflation is at a 45-year high. The cost of a traditional Christmas dinner has risen 3 times faster than wages this year. And what about petrol, mortgages and rents hitting your homes? The cost of living is rising at its fastest pace in 4 decades. In 2022, global inflation was on the cusp of double digits. There's no single reason why. The war in Ukraine fueled an energy crisis. Supply and demand mismatches stemming from the pandemic persist. all creating a climate of financial uncertainty. And that's why central banks have yanked up interest rates more this year than in decades, with the aim of pushing back against inflation. Bank of America says there's been the equivalent of one hike somewhere in the world for every trading day of 2022. But despite the Bank of England, European Central Bank, Swiss National Bank and beyond, and most aggressively at the US Fed, raising rates, inflation hasn't cooled as much as hoped. So what can we expect in 2023? The worst case scenario is that inflation stays stubborn. Recessions kick in, central bankers squeeze borrowers even more, and consumers hold back. All of that stunts growth, which is bad news for jobs and means there could be a prolonged period of stagflation. The European Central Bank does expect to increase borrowing costs significantly further as inflation forecasts show prices overshooting targets through to 2025. But remember the Bank of England's glimmer of a possibility that inflation will come down at some point next year, in which case the best case scenario is that prices stabilise. That means rents, energy, petrol and food prices all coming down enough so that policymakers can stop raising rates and maybe gradually reduce them to boost growth. I don't have a crystal ball, but it's clear that the focus for policymakers in 2023 will be cracking inflation.
Ship insurers say they're cancelling war risk insurance cover across Russia, Ukraine and Belarus from the 1st of January. This move comes after reinsurers largely left the market because of mounting losses. Insurers use reinsurers to mitigate risks by passing business to them, thereby spreading the entire cost of potential claims. The groups cancelling war cover are responsible for 90% of ocean-going shipping insurance. Saudi Aramco's refining subsidiary has slumped in its trading debut. Shares in Lubref dropped as much as 6.6% in Riyadh to $24.61 following its IPO. Lubref operates two facilities on Saudi Arabia's west coast, producing various base oils and byproducts. House prices in Hong Kong fell 3.3% in November, with the market set to record its first annual fall since 2008. Hong Kong property prices have dropped 13.8% in the first 11 months of this year. Electric car exports from China hit a record high in November, fueled by European demand. EVs with a combined value of $3.2 billion were shipped to overseas markets. That's more than 2.5 times the figure from the previous year. Belgium and the UK among the biggest importers. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the death toll reaches 60 in the United States in that once-in-a-generation storm.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with me, Jamie Owen. Our top stories. Civilians continue to flee Kherson as Russia intensifies its attacks, while France's defense minister arrives in Kyiv amid criticism over his country's support. Our other headlines: Moscow rejects a plan to end the conflict put forward by Ukraine. It included the withdrawal of Russian troops and recognition of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Meteorologists say temperatures in the United States will begin to warm over the next few days, but they're warning that could lead to flooding as the snow melts. More than 60 people have now been killed across the country by what's being described as a once-in-a-generation storm. The Buffalo area of New York is worst hit. Well, the extreme cold is also causing travel chaos, as our correspondent John Terrett was mentioning a little earlier. The low-cost carrier Southwest Airlines has cancelled around 70% of its flights, leaving thousands of passengers stranded. The US government says the rate of cancellations is unacceptable. Our correspondent Adiz Tianchan reports.
Thousands of holiday travelers remain stranded here at the Los Angeles International Airport after Southwest Airlines canceled or delayed many of its flights for a second straight day. And it's not just here in LA. The company has canceled some 2,900 flights nationwide. And to give you an idea, that's about 70% of all its flights. This comes after a historic winter storm impacted much of the U.S., closing some airports and causing widespread disruptions for many airlines. And just when we thought these cancellations were easing up, Southwest travelers found themselves scrambling for alternative ways to get home.
I guess I'm leaving. All the trains are full. The cars are triple booked, buses, so basically, I don't know, maybe a ship, but I'm just trying to get back home.
I have to stay here for 4 days. Then no, I'm not going to stay here for 4 days. I'm going to rent a car and drive.
We had something planned for Saturday evening. I'm just frustrated. Southwest is my favorite airline. But right now, I'm pretty frustrated.
Some people here had to wait up to 4 hours just to speak to an airline representative. For many, getting their money back is not an issue, but we understand getting their hotel and other expenses covered hasn't been a smooth process either. Some are feeling so desperate that they've paid hundreds of dollars to get a car and take the hours-long drive home. Southwest Airlines blames the extreme winter weather across the country and called the disruptions unacceptable. However, the president of the union that represents the company's flight attendants said the complete and utter chaos wasn't due to a lack of staffing, but rather to Southwest's what he called archaic and outdated systems. In fact, we've also heard from the U.S. Department of Transportation saying it was concerned by Southwest's unacceptable rate of cancellations and delays, as well as reports of a lack of prompt customer service. The department said it will examine whether cancellations were controllable and if Southwest is complying with its customer service plan. The company said it was working to reposition flight crews in order to return to normal reliability, but added that it will operate only about 1/3 of its scheduled flights for the next few days. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
Well, Mark Summer is a reporter at Buffalo News. I asked him to describe the scale of the disruption caused by this weather.
A few days ago, more than half the country was subject to a weather advisory or weather warning, given the conditions. Here in Buffalo, we've really taken it probably worse than anybody. Just to give your audience an idea, on Friday and Saturday, we had 2 consecutive days of sustained whiteout. Now, I don't know if people know what that means, but whiteout conditions are when you really can't see more than a few feet in front of you. And it was like that. Personally, I've experienced it, for short periods of time. I've never seen anything like this, where it was literally for 2 full days. On top of that, we had swirling, gusty winds of up to 70 miles an hour, and 109 centimeters of snow dropped in 2 days. So it was just a convergence of weather systems that made life extremely difficult. And we're in the 4th day of recovery now, trying to get out of that.
Mark, we're now getting suggestions that the snow's going, but warnings about the consequences of flooding next. What are the authorities there saying?
Well, honestly, we're not hearing a lot about flooding concerns just yet, because right now the biggest concerns are clearing roads, still making it possible to have access routes for emergency vehicles like ambulances and the like, and still checking people's homes. A few people have frozen to death in their homes. A few people froze to death in their cars. There's a travel ban in effect still for Buffalo and parts of the county that Buffalo sits in. Unfortunately, a number of people went out in their cars after the travel ban went into effect. They got stranded. Their cars blocked the ability for fire trucks, police, ambulances, and other responders to drive on the roads. And some people got stuck in their cars, and in a few cases I mentioned, actually froze to death. 33 people have died in this aftermath of the Buffalo blizzard.
And 60 people dead throughout this blizzard. Obviously an enormous shock to that community. I wonder what has been the most problematic part of this storm?
Well, the loss of life is the most problematic part. It's just so tragic that people went for days in freezing temperatures without heat, number one, and had difficulty leaving their houses because we had snowdrifts, sometimes leaving walls of snow 4 or 5 feet tall near the entrance to your door. The roads and the sidewalks hadn't been cleared yet. So, especially for seniors, people with health issues or disabilities, it made it extremely difficult to get out of the house. So that's all been very difficult. And the problem with the cars blocking the roads all over the place has really hampered rescue operations.
A top German virologist says the coronavirus pandemic is now over. His comments come as the country looks set to lift all remaining restrictions. Our correspondent Peter Oliver is in Berlin. Peter, good to see you. This might come as something of a surprise to those people and countries still struggling with COVID. Christian Drosten was one of the most cautious scientists during the pandemic. So what is his judgment based on?
Right, well, he says that we're currently seeing the first endemic wave of the COVID-19 virus. Difference between endemic and pandemic. In my most basic layman's of terms, basically endemic is when it spreads within a set area as opposed to globally, and it spreads at a rate that's either under control or a rate that is being prepared for and expected. Now, Christian Drosten, you mentioned his credentials there. He's probably the most famous virologist in Germany right now. He's the head of virology at the most famous hospital in Germany, the Charité, world-famous Charité hospital. But his opinion isn't backed up by everyone. Now, Germany's still seeing around 100,000 COVID cases every week. They're looking at an average of about just over 1,000 COVID deaths every week as well. And that's prompted the Doctors' Union, that's the Federal Association for German Medical Officers, to say they aren't so much on side with what Mr. Drosten has had to say. They think that these measures that have been put in place, measures such as wearing of masks on public transport, as well as when visiting hospitals or care homes, that these should remain in place for now. However, there are enough voices that do side with Christian Drosten, including those that are on the government advisory panel for COVID, and they're certainly putting that message to ministers who have been speaking about wanting to lift measures that are still in place here from a federal level across Germany, lift those across the whole country.
Justice Minister Marco Buschmann has called for the last restrictive measures to be lifted. So what might that mean if it goes ahead for the economy?
Well, Marco Buschmann knows all about these measures because alongside Health Minister Karl Lauterbach, he wrote them. He wrote the legislation that put in place the measures that we see. I mentioned some of them that involve the wearing of masks on public transport and elsewhere. However, yeah, as far as a lot of the states are concerned, and it is a states issue here in Germany, there's 16 states make up the Federal Republic, they have decided, some of them, that they're going to get rid of those already. That's Bavaria and Saxony-Anhalt. They did that right at the beginning of this month, the beginning of December. We know that Schleswig-Holstein are planning to do that in January. A number of others have also said that they're going to get rid of the measures at the end of winter. Now, in an interesting big change is that if you look at states like Bavaria, Hesse, Baden-Württemberg, Schleswig-Holstein and the Rhineland-Palatinate, you don't have to isolate anymore if you test positive for COVID. Now, one of the big reasons that this is being done, and one of the reasons that Marco Buschmann is behind trying to get the measures lifted, is to do with business. Buschmann comes from the Free Democrats, very pro-business party, part of the ruling coalition here in Germany. They want to see Germany open up as much as possible for business, and they see getting rid of these measures as being key for that in some areas, particularly when it comes to tourism coming back to Germany. If we look at what was lost during COVID, you were looking at a 9.9% drop-off in exports from Germany. You were also looking at an 8.6% drop-off when it came to imports of things like goods and services. That included tourism. Germany has spent billions and billions, close to $500 billion, in fact, dollars on trying to make sure the economy didn't take such a big impact from the COVID pandemic. It has worked to an extent. However, what we are seeing, of course, now is the knock-on effects of the energy crisis caused by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. That's led to them having to spend more and more money. It's seeing politicians like Buschmann say, we need to get rid of the COVID measures to try and make sure that we're bringing in money and the economy's kicking on in that way.
Peter, good to see you. Thank you for that. Our correspondent, Peter Oliver, in Berlin. "2022 has been an extraordinary year in British politics. The country has had 3 prime ministers, a string of political scandals, and suffered the effects of a disastrous budget. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson looks back over the last 12 months.
At the start of the year, UK hospitals were struggling with COVID, and the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson was confirming his attendance at a party in the garden of 10 Downing Street.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise.
By the end of January, the newspapers were alleging more parties inside Downing Street and in other government buildings. Boris Johnson was also exploring a new role as cheerleader for Ukraine ahead of a Russian invasion few realised was about to take place. In March, the Metropolitan Police announced that 20 fixed penalty notices were to be issued as part of the Downing Street party inquiry, but no names or places were mentioned. By April, Russia's attack on Ukraine had hit gas supplies. The UK price cap jumped by 54%, and the Bank of England officially warned of a coming energy crisis. By now, a 4th COVID vaccination was underway for certain age groups. In May, the first groups of Conservative MPs formally started calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister. At the beginning of June, to the backdrop of the celebrations for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, a vote of confidence was held in Boris Johnson's leadership of the party. He survived, but 40% voted against him. Also in June, the Bank of England announces the 5th consecutive rise in interest rates as inflation starts to bite.
What do we want?
And rail and transport unions announced the first days of strikes on the railways and in the ports. A month later, the Prime Minister's hit by mass resignations within his cabinet, including, most damaging of all, that of Rishi Sunak, his Chancellor. And on the 7th of July, Boris Johnson announces his resignation. The ensuing leadership competition is drawn out and exhaustive before narrowing down to 2 candidates. Former Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Foreign Secretary Liz Truss.
And one of them had all these fantastic ideas about how to rebuild and re-energise the economy, going for growth. And the other one saying, those ideas are bonkers, we need to do something like that, but let's do it a lot more slowly and a lot more carefully. And people didn't like this. No, you can't do that approach. So they voted for Liz Truss, and she won overwhelmingly.
And then, against the backdrop of a mass state funeral for Queen Elizabeth II, who dies 2 days after the change at Downing Street, Prime Minister Truss and her new Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, launched the now infamous mini-budget.
But I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether.
And international markets take fright. The economy nosedives, and within 7 weeks, Rishi Sunak replaces Truss as Prime Minister. The UK goes into the new year against a backdrop of inflation, strikes, tax hikes, and cuts in public spending. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
It's a dark chapter of the UK's Second World War history, a story of racial prejudice that resulted in broken families, lost heritage, and a campaign to make British authorities apologise.
Thousands of Chinese seamen now serving with the Allied Merchant Navy, bringing food to Britain, munitions from America.
Chinese sailors based in Liverpool served alongside Allied soldiers, but were forcibly repatriated when the war ended. Hundreds of men vanished overnight, leaving behind wives and children in Liverpool without any explanation of where they'd gone. I've been talking to some of those families for the CGTN documentary, The Secret Betrayal.
I feel like we've been robbed slightly of our heritage, and it's all to do with self-identity, so it matters. And when you don't look the same as other people, you don't quite fit in. There's a negative element there with the racism, and we've never had anything positive to readdress it and rebalance it.
My entire life, people say to me, where are you from? You're obviously not fully British. And then I'm left with that awkward position of, I actually don't know anything about my culture or my roots, or other than a sailor's name.
I want to know who my father is. I want to know who my Chinese family is, who they are, where they are, because they're a missing part of me. They're a missing part of my family.
And you can watch the full documentary by going to cgtn.com/The Secret Betrayal. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Messi's magic, Beijing's winter wonderland, and farewell to Federer, an unforgettable year in the world of sport.
I fell in love with Chinese culture the second I started to experience it.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
Building bridges is a natural thing. There is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul.
I think food is an incredible way of bringing different cultures together. I am enjoying learning every aspect about it.
Chinese literature stretches back for millennia, but it's still really relevant for today.
I hope that Chinese and British fashion community could be more frequently communicating with each other.
An incredible mix of people, cultures, food, and there is so much to see and so much to do.
I have a great desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible.
It's about our future generation's future.
The craftsmanship, the technique, the material uses, the color uses.
You can kind of take things on board and continue to develop and grow.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Everything seems to have a story. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. A huge tick.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The United States Supreme Court has ruled that a pandemic-era border policy that's blocked thousands of people from crossing from Mexico must remain. Known as Title 42, the controversial policy gives officials the power to quickly expel undocumented migrants. Our correspondent Jagruti Dave reports now from Washington.
This is a big move by the US Supreme Court. Title 42, that Trump-era policy that was enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic, was set to expire, but the United States Supreme Court says that it will be extended temporarily while it considers the legal challenges put forward by Republican states. Now, Republican attorney generals have been arguing that the lifting of Title 42 would mean an influx of migrants at US borders, particularly the southern border between the United States and Mexico. The Biden administration, one of its arguments was that there was no need for this pandemic-era policy to remain because the conditions surrounding the start of the pandemic are no longer in place. Now, what this means for the thousands of migrants who have been desperately trying to get in and seek asylum at the US southern border, it clearly is going to be disappointment. The White House has issued a statement saying that they will comply with the order, but that they will advance preparations to manage the border in a secure, orderly and humane way when Title 42 eventually lifts. We have, of course, seen many Republican states taking matters into their own hands and busing migrants to Democratic-run cities like New York, Chicago and, of course, here in Washington, D.C. Jagruti Dave, CGTN, Washington.
Throughout this year, we've been meeting people who've dedicated their lives to building relationships between China and the UK, bringing the two countries closer together. The Chinese-British Guo family have been sharing their story.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China. They became known as the Icebreakers. Now meet the bridge builders, the individuals continuing the icebreaker spirit to open up our world.
So far, live. 朋友们好，大家好，大家好，大家好。How are you? 好久没见。Miss you. My dad's an amazing musician. My mum's an amazing gardener. But I feel like they never really had lots of people being able to enjoy their art and their work. Finally, people have a chance to see them and to interact with them. Now it's like thousands, millions of people. So for me, that makes me really proud.
I was born in Beijing. Our family was really poor, but we had really, really nice time. When I was in China, I was professional musician. I'm doing so well, and I was soloist in the Peking Film Orchestra. My sister was here first, and she's saying, you have opportunity come to England. So I just gave up my job. I bought single tickets from Beijing to London. I saw some people basking in the underground station. I saw, why I'm not trying that? So I tried basking in South Kensington. And then I met their Irish band. It's called the Chieftains. And they immediately asked me to have a tour with them. For 17 years, we have the chance to playing music with Worldwide, and also we're traveling all over the world. We represent China. We met so many people. I met a lot of famous musicians. We had a fantastic time. That's my first time recording for the Hollywood film in the Abbey Road studio. And then I played for the Last Emperor with David Byrne.
I met Gui when he was busking in South Ken.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Toto was born in 1992.
Yeah.
And it was amazing, actually, because I'd always been told I might not be able to have children, so he was a sort of a gift.
大家好，我是郭头头。
Well, yeah, my name is Toto. I come from London. My dad is Chinese, my mum is English, so mixed background. And I am a vlogger, model, host, kind of general Chinese media guy. I remember at a very young age being quite confused. What does this mean to be half British, half Chinese? Because I knew that that meant that I was different from a lot of my British friends. From a young age, I remember feeling a real distance between me and my dad because he was always working, and I think as a result of that, I never really spent enough time with him for us to bond properly and for him to teach me any Chinese at all. But at the same time, I was very interested, and it was always a kind of dream of mine to go there and finally, you know, become Chinese and explore that side of me. I was 25 when I first went to China to live and began learning Chinese. The culture there is so different from London. You know, in London, it's a fantastic place. I love how multicultural it is, and it's my home. And what's different in Beijing is that China feels very connected. It feels like a very united culture, and so it kind of feels like one big family. And slowly, I felt more and more part of that.
When I first came back to the UK, I felt trapped. I was like, oh my God, I lost my life in China, and mum and dad weren't well, and it was a really dark situation. But then because we've been doing the videos and we found some really interesting ways to reach China from the UK. It also means we spend more time together, which we never really did before. It's very strange, but it's also really sweet.
Should we plug it in and see what
Yeah, it makes me really proud to finally let them show their art, their talent.
I'm English and Gui is Chinese. I think there's an interest in that. And in the gardening one I do, I think because a lot of people love gardening.
I'm already nearly 70 years old. I don't have much time left. When I have this energy, I want doing a lot of things to build between China and England.
It is like building bridges and making friends and building a community. So this kind of mixed community is getting bigger and bigger, and I hope in the future there's more and more and more bridge builders. Yeah. It'll make a better world.
I feel quite a little bit proud that we've maybe brought something together. You know, I think sharing something so two different cultures can see that we're not that different.
The secret to a happy family life, you take 50% Chinese wisdom, 50% British wisdom, put them together, that's the secret to a happy family life.
哎，再见，朋友们，再见哦，这么多朋友还。
It's been a bumpy year in the world of sport, with momentous milestones and some high-profile exits. 2022 ended on a high, of course, for Argentina's Lionel Messi, who finally got his hands on that World Cup after one of the greatest finals of all time. The Women's Euros broke attendance records and saw England win its first major trophy since 1966. Beijing became the first city to host both the Summer and Winter Olympic Games, while tennis said farewell to two of its all-time greats, Roger Federer, of course, and Serena Williams. Well, let's talk to Paul Scott, the international sports broadcaster and commentator who was at many of these events. Paul, welcome. Good to see you. What were some of your sporting events that particularly struck you this year?
Hi, Jamie. Good to talk to you. Firstly, wasn't it just great to have a relatively normal sporting calendar after the last couple of years being disrupted by COVID? I was fortunate enough, as you say, to be out in Beijing at the start of the year. I'm sure many of your viewers will look back on that fondly. One of the highlights of the year, Beijing becoming the first city to host both the Summer and the Winter Olympics. And one of the stars of the Games, the poster girl really, was the home favourite Eileen Gu, who became not only the first freestyle skier to win 3 medals at a single Olympics, but also the youngest ever freestyle skier to win gold. She claimed gold in the big air and the half pipe, silver in the slopestyle, and really was one of the stars of the Games for for China. You had Norway topping the medals table. They got 16 gold medals. That itself was a record. No nation has achieved that many gold medals before. And a quick word about Irene Wurst as well, who won gold at her 5th Winter Games. Such an achievement there. So talking of one legend of the sport with Irene Wurst, you mentioned the departure of Roger Federer. You can't look back on 2022 without that being one of the highlights that night in London, where he bowed out, playing doubles with his long-term rival Rafael Nadal. It finished in the early hours of this morning. Of the morning in London, about 1:30, I think it was, and Rafael Nadal was crying, Roger Federer was crying, Novak Djokovic was there crying. It was a really fitting tribute. Just a quick word about Serena Williams. She says she's evolving away from tennis. She has left the door open, saying she could return in 2023, so watch this space. And I suppose another highlight, of course, was Lionel Messi lifting that World Cup for Argentina. It was a controversial World Cup coming into it. The first Arab World Cup, the first World Cup to be held in the Middle East. Of course, a lot of focus was on the rights of minorities, migrant workers and their deaths in the build-up to the tournament. But when the football began, in terms of a footballing sense, it really was a great World Cup. Morocco becoming the first Arab nation, the first African nation to reach the semi-finals. And of course, a fitting end for Lionel Messi's career as he got to finally lift his first ever World Cup trophy.
Paul, it's all history now. That's the year gone. Let's look ahead. 2023 shaping up to be as exciting, do you think?
Yeah, it won't be quite as big in terms of the sporting year. You're going to have all the usual events, the tennis Grand Slams, the golf majors. You can bung in a couple of big international events into that. You've got the Women's World Cup. Now, the first Women's World Cup was actually held in China back in 1991, but an awful lot has changed since then. This one is going to be held in Australia and New Zealand, combined across the two countries. It's the first time that the Women's World Cup will have 32 teams. It's been expanded from the 24 that competed in France in 2019. When the very first World Cup took place in China back in 91, there were only 12 teams. So that shows you over the last 3 decades how much that sport has grown. England winning the European Championship, as you mentioned. Can the Lionesses go global? You've also got the Cricket World Cup. That's going to be taking place in India later in the year. It's been rescheduled from February because qualification was disrupted by COVID-19, so that's been pushed back. England, incidentally, also the defending champions in that one. And in the autumn, you'll have the Rugby World Cup as well, taking place in France, South Africa, the defending champions. England going into that with a new coach after sacking Eddie Jones. So although 2023 perhaps doesn't have as many major international sporting events as 2022, there is definitely still plenty to look forward to.
Paul, good to see you. Thank you for that. Paul Scott, the international sports broadcaster and commentator. The headlines again. Civilians continue to flee Kherson as Russia intensifies its attacks, while France's defense minister arrives in Kyiv amid criticism over his country's support. Our other headlines: Moscow rejects a plan to end the conflicts put forward by Ukraine. It included the total withdrawal of Russian troops and recognition of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And the death toll now reaches 60 as the United States counts the cost of a once-in-a-generation storm. And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching. Much more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com. And do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. See you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.